Welcome to you all for the second global conference of the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network. I'm Bertrand Lachapelle. I'm the executive director of this multi-stakeholder, the secretariat of this multi-stakeholder organization. It's an amazing sight after Paris to see you all here. Thank you so much for having come, sometimes from very, very far. I would be remiss to start without extending an extreme gratitude to the people in Canada who have actually helped us make this possible. People in the government, in various ministries, particularly the Ministry for Innovation, Science and Economic Development, I said, and also Global Affairs, Canada, and also in Canada, CIRA, the CCTLD manager, who has been tremendously helpful for a lot of the organization. You know how difficult it is to organize something at a distance. So a big gratitude to them. The second thing is that, of course, I would like to thank you for being here. And at the time when you made the registration for the flights, you expected a pretty harsh winter. It hasn't panned out, so it's all good. But I want to highlight that the fact that you were willing to make the effort to come here under very potentially harsh climatic condition is a testimony to your dedication and commitment to tackling those complex issues. So thank you to you all. I sincerely mean it, and I see in the room many faces of people that have been engaged in those questions for a long time and engaged in the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network and this pioneering exercise for several years. But I'm also extremely happy to welcome to this family new faces and new people. The goal is to broaden the reach and making sure that all the different perspectives are taken into account. You know, it's not a traditional conference. Just the setting here is illustrative. It's not a traditional conference. There's no panels, no distinction between panelists and the audience. You're all basically seasoned professionals. You're dealing with those issues on a daily basis. And if I may dare to say, you're all at the same time struggling and striving to address them. And the reason why you're here is basically because we're all facing those problems that we have in common. The format today, tomorrow, and afterwards is intended to allow you to have, for a brief moment, for only a few days, an opportunity to step back from the pressures of urgency and daily urgency, and have, I hope, brief but rich amount of interactions in that regard. The second element is that this is also, importantly, a milestone event, the second milestone event in a process that was started back in 2012 and that was strongly accelerated a bit more than a year ago with the first Global Internet and Jurisdiction Conference in Paris that a certain number of you already attended. A lot has happened since Paris, inside the policy network and also outside, as you all know. We will come back to that later. But what I want to highlight, only one thing at that stage, is that Paris was basically about framing the problems in a way that is a common problem and not a problem or a conflict that you have with each other. And this conference is intended to go beyond that. It's about framing common objectives, the way forward, the path to achieve common objectives, and to design a clear roadmap between now and the third conference that will take place in Berlin in partnership with the government of Germany. So, without further ado, I want to open this session and start by asking to launch a message from Mr. NAVDEEP BAINS, who is the Minister for Innovation, Science and Economic Development in Canada, who would very much have liked to be here, but unfortunately for those who are not familiar with the way Canada works, they seem to have a tendency to care about presenting their budget broadly. So it seems very strange for a certain number of other countries. I won't name them. But it turns out that the minister is taken by this important task. So we have a video message. And then David McGovern will take the floor afterwards. If we can launch the video, please.
Hello, bonjour, and welcome to Canada's beautiful capital region. My name is NAVDEEP BAINS, and it is my pleasure to oversee Canada's internet policy as Minister of Innovation, Science, and Economic Development. I want to thank you for the excellent work you're doing at this conference. Je suis NAVDEEP BAINS, Ministre de l'Innovation, des Sciences et du Développement économique. J'ai le plaisir d'être responsable de la politique d'Internet du Canada. Merci pour votre excellent travail à cette conférence. Canada is pleased to support the Global Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network. We know that it's important to take time to think about the Internet and the future of society. Since the year 2000, the number of Internet users across the globe has increased dramatically by 500%. Now, more than ever, we know that the Internet is essential to advancing our individual quality of life and our collective prosperity. It is important that the Internet continues to remain open and secure to promote innovation, democracy, and inclusiveness. We see the challenge of keeping the Internet open as paramount. Net neutrality and the open Internet are critical issues of our time, much like freedom of the press and freedom of expression that came before them. That's why our government supports all the efforts at this conference. In particular, we support discussion on how we can work together to foster greater global support for net neutrality and the Internet as a platform for growth. Let's work together to find the best way forward to keep the Internet open and accessible to all. Have a great conference. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. And now we get to the other opening speakers. The rule is very simple. It's 7 minutes. And David McGovern will be the first person to speak. He is the Associate Deputy Minister in the Department of Innovation, Science and Economic Development in Canada. David, you have the floor.
Thank you very much.
It's not on.
How many engineers does it take? Can you hear me now? Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon at this non-traditional conference. And I'm pleased to see non-tradition extends to the use of a podium, which should be good. When I was in kindergarten or prématernelle, one of my classmates was able to pat his head and rub his stomach at the same time. And I thought that was very impressive, and I worked for a long time to be able to do two things at once. So I will do my best holding a microphone and reading my remarks. So it goes without saying I echo the comments of Minister BAINS. Thank you all for being here today. Il s'agit d'un événement important pour la communauté Internet et juridiction. Faisant suite à l'allocution du ministre, je tiens à vous parler de ce qui va se présenter au cours des 2 prochains jours. So following on my minister's remarks, I'd like to move the focus onto the next 2 days. Within the context of an open internet economy, preserving multi-stakeholder innovation is crucial, and this demands moving beyond individual interests to see collective opportunity. In this spirit, the Paris conference framed the issues that we will be discussing over the next few days, and now in Ottawa, we can again make concrete progress. By agreeing on key questions to guide further work on data, content, and domains, we can lay the groundwork to come up with solutions on the way to Berlin. I see 3 key considerations that can help guide our efforts. First, growing the digital economy to create jobs while preserving security and respecting human rights. Inclusion is another. It's also important to strive for policy coherence and interoperability between initiatives. Understanding about the importance of the cross-border internet to business, our economies and society has broadened. C'est seulement grâce à une compréhension commune que nous pouvons assurer l'interopérabilité des initiatives qui touchent un éventail de sujets comme la technologie, la protection des renseignements personnels et la concurrence. It's only with this common understanding that we can ensure interoperability of initiatives that touch on a range of topics such as technology, privacy, and competition. At the international level, 2018 will be busy. Besides being a supporter of this conference, Canada will also be hosting the G7. My department, Innovation, Science, and Economic Development, along with Economic and Social Development Canada, will be hosting the first of 4 ministerial meetings for Canada's G7 presidency. Our ministerial will focus on preparing for jobs of the future, and it's scheduled, and this point is not lost on me as I am assisting with the organization, in 1 month's time in Montreal. The Innovation Minister's discussions and outcomes are centered on the themes of the impact that transformative technologies will have on the economy and society, common approaches to artificial intelligence, and stimulating innovation. We are seeking agreement with our G7 counterparts on common approaches to AI, centered on economic development, inclusion, and multi-stakeholder engagement. This element is currently also being considered for a possible deliverable for leaders at the summit. My department is pursuing a broad and inclusive engagement strategy involving business leaders, Indigenous peoples, women's group, and youth. Bottom-up efforts are pivotal to furthering the conversation and identifying where practical steps can be taken to address problems with the potential to scale. Undertaking to identify a particular challenge and consider potential solutions, as the Global Internet and Jurisdiction Project has done, creates opportunity. Au fond, nous essayons de trouver des solutions pratiques à de grands problèmes. Fundamentally, we're trying to find practical solutions to big problems. Efforts will need to move beyond any one particular interest or institution to realize the collective opportunity. Et c'est ce que nous sommes venus faire à Ottawa. And this is what we're here to do in Ottawa. Thank you, everybody. Merci, and good luck with this conference. Merci.
Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to give the floor to VINT CERF, who is the Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist at Google, and has something to do historically, I think, with the Internet. Tell me more.
It's just age. He's been around for a long time. Well, I certainly appreciate Minister McGovern's comments. First of all, you did it in 2 languages in less than 6 minutes, so that's quite impressive. So this is the second global conference of the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network, and it's time to make progress, defining a way forward towards an increasingly beneficial Internet in anticipation of the billions who will gain access to it as this decade ends. At its origin, I hoped that the Internet would be a platform through which all its users would be free to share and access information and computing power of all kinds. As it became apparent that it was a commercially supportable service, it seemed that barriers to its use would fall, and indeed, half the planet's population is now online. The arrival of the World Wide Web and subsequent search engines vastly simplified the creation, discovery, and sharing of content. I see what you mean about padding your... Neutrality is still a key part of the Internet's success. Internet packets still don't know how they're carried or what they carry. But it is apparent that the freedom of expression the Internet invites has some social downsides. Mixed into the vast, useful, or at least innocuous content of the Internet is harmful, wrong, abusive, and misleading material injected by intent or ignorance and which disrupts social norms. Moreover, the system is an avenue for a wide range of cyber attacks, including malware and denial of service, to name but two. How did we get here? We cooperated to create technical standards. We found business models to help the Internet flourish and access to it to increase. And we discovered what Shakespeare knew when he wrote his plays. People are imperfect, and some have motivations that lead to harm to others. We must employ the same tools and methods that built the Internet to improve its safety, security, privacy, and utility. We must apply these tools at the appropriate layers in the Internet's architecture to avoid damage to the essential openness that makes the Internet work and allows it to evolve. We must seek social norms to guide further evolution of the system. We must improve digital literacy to deepen the general public's awareness of and defense against online risks. We must protect the public core of the Internet from deliberate damage. We must apply multinational and multi-stakeholder deliberation to identify new goals and cooperate to achieve them. The global nature of the Internet demands transnational cooperation and collaboration to diminish the effects of harmful behavior, but we must find ways to protect human rights while protecting ourselves from those who violate them. National sovereignty is sometimes cited as a reason to close borders and refuse cooperation. And yet we have learned that it is in the national interest to cooperate for the benefits of trade, social coherence, planetary concerns, and yes, law enforcement. Ironically, the independence of the networks that make up the Internet is the key ingredient to its growth and resilience. There is no center, but for the necessary cooperation needed to assure uniqueness in the identifier spaces of the Internet. Technical standards are the means by which independent cooperation among the networks leads to the global Internet. Norms may be the means by which we achieve collaborative intervention against harmful behaviors on the Internet. Protocols are a form of cooperation, and perhaps it is now time to invent new diplomatic protocols aided by technology to fashion an Internet worthy of persistence and global access. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, VINT, and it's my pleasure now to ask Kathy Brown, who is the President and CEO of the Internet Society, to follow up.
Thank you, Bertrand and Paul, for this invitation to participate in this very important conference. It is always a great privilege of mine to follow the founder of the Internet Society, VINT CERF, and in many ways to echo his message. This organization, this group you've put together, has demonstrated commitment, perseverance, and the tenacity needed to develop this very new approach that you'll hear many of us talking about. And it's my sincere hope that with all the work that has preceded this conference, that we'll see some breakthrough, the kind that is required for us to meet the complex issues that we face. Indeed, these are complex times. And in the Internet space, complexity is both our strength and it's our challenge. From the beginning of the world's discussion about governance on the Internet, and about the internet, there has been an intuitive understanding that the very nature of the internet, a voluntary network of networks that is agnostic to sovereign borders and allows its users to create and operate without central control, required new governance, quote unquote, mechanisms. As the trans-global internet has grown and evolved, it has delivered on the promise of an era of knowledge expansion, innovation, and economic growth. At the same time, it has also presented the world with perplexing choices in how to ensure that human beings, people, remain in control of their inherently social destiny while the technology moves at a breathtaking pace. In 2005, the book The World is Flat, there Thomas Friedman described the desired outcome, the notorious desired outcome at this point, of globalization. At the time, that was not a verboten word that it's become. This globalization was primarily driven by the forces unleashed by the internet, and one that offered equal opportunity for everyone everywhere to compete for the future without regard to borders or regulatory rules. 12 years later, in his recent book called Thanks for Listening, one that I highly, highly recommend that we all read, Friedman looks back on his earlier thinking and admits that with all that opportunity became complexity, which should have been anticipated and for which we were unprepared. We now face the enormous challenges as the pace of change has advanced and accelerated faster than did our human institutions, societal and existing global agreements. Many of our governments, despite their commitment to this different model, they all raised their hand at WSIS 10, I would remind us all, are doubling down on what they know how to do. Shut it down, shut it off, censor users, regulate creators. The global internet community itself is in danger of splintering with predictable commercial, social, and geopolitical camps, and user trust is being lost by bad actors, exploiting the very vulnerabilities that we understood but failed to adequately address. So, the world has changed, but our governing approaches, despite years of our promotion of multi-stakeholder processes, have not. So what are we doing here, and what are we to do? It seems to me that we need to address and be honest about the social anxieties, legitimate government concerns, and economic realities that are today's internet and today's world. The question today is, what are we going to do? Keep using the same old approaches and pretend that if we just delay long enough, it will all go away? Or will we facilitate some new things? It's been the consistent, value-based position of this community that decision-making in a complex world, in an internet world, must be collaborative, inclusive, transparent, and multi-stakeholder. We could all say these words one after another. And that is for good reason. In complex ecosystems, norms need to be set by diverse communities serving diverse needs and must be designed for the good of the whole. Processes must be flexible and decision-making must be collaborative and agile. This is not utopian theory. This is what happens in complex ecosystems if we are going to succeed. And governmental efforts at control, self-serving business models, unilateral security communiques are not going to be successful. New models are required, and we need to act now. This is why, Bertrand, the work you're leading here is crucial and urgent. Cross-border cooperation for enforcement of agreed-upon norms is a must. The alternative, just shut the borders, is not acceptable. The Internet Society, consistent with the work here, is also stepping up through our multi-stakeholder action initiative and the newly announced collaborative governance project where we're calling on governments to reform their processes, and where under Larry Strickling's leadership, thank you for joining us, Larry, we want to facilitate communities that are ready to use these processes and do the research and do the training necessary to do it. The Canadian government, we're very pleased that the government is also stepping up into these processes and will demonstrate how it works through looking at standards for security on IoT devices. So here we are. We need to applaud so many people here in the room who have done work to get us to this place. The Net Mundial principles of equal footing remind us that all stakeholders have an equal and legitimate interest to participate. I want to acknowledge also CGI, CIGI, ICANN, and all those who have been studying and modeling various approaches that hold promise. But now it's time to stop studying and to start doing. The challenges we face is to keep people at the heart of the internet, and we need to act in order to do that and evolve into this new world. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kathy. And actually, the mic doesn't go that far because it's the person sitting right to her right. Matthew Prince was the CEO of Cloudflare, who has the floor now. Please.
Thank you, Bertrand. And I have to apologize. Je parle seulement un petit peu de français. And not very well at that. So I'm the co-founder and CEO of Cloudflare. And if you hadn't heard of Cloudflare before, we're usually behind the scenes and don't come to a number of these conferences that often. What we do for our customers is we make sure that they are secure with whatever content they're putting online, and that content can be reached wherever it is in the world as quickly and efficiently as possible. We see essentially every active internet user pass through our network. About 10% of all internet requests. You've all used our network hundreds of times probably in the last 24 hours, and when we're doing our job right, you don't exist. I won't be offended, though, if what you think of when you see me is I'm the guy who woke up in a grumpy mood one morning and kicked Nazis off the internet. And while that was portrayed very much as an arbitrary decision publicly, internally at Cloudflare, the policies around what we should do as an internet infrastructure provider is something that we have thought about a ton, and we debate a ton, and we think about a ton. But what we hadn't done enough of, I think, is participate in a multi-stakeholder environment like this. And so I was very pleased to be invited, and I'm very honored to be here. If I think about what Cloudflare's mission is, it's to help build a better internet. And that word help is really important because we don't think we can do it alone. We think that we are just one of many organizations working together to build this thing that is the internet. And so as we have multi-stakeholder conversations, I think conferences like this are incredibly important, and again, we're honored to be here. One of the questions, though, is exactly where we fit. We're not in the registry track, really. We're also not a content provider that goes in the content track, and while we handle a whole bunch of data, I don't think we really belong in the data track either. What is interesting is, as we think about the various work streams, and what I would encourage you to do is, if we acknowledge that there are differences between different types of providers, and the rules that apply to those providers have to be different. If the rules that apply to registries should be different than the rules that apply to content platforms, then we need to ask ourselves why. What are the fundamental reasons why we have these different sets of rules and why those rules exist? And I would encourage you, as the British would say, to mind the gap, because there is an importance in the distinctions and the gaps between these various work streams that we put down. And if we have gaps that exist there, then either abuse could take place, we could have the Wild West that sets up between that, or equally problematically, companies that don't really belong, don't really fit in the models that are set down here could get dragged into those models, and we could actually resist or retard innovation in new business models and new technologies. I'm doing the paper shuffle too. So as we think about it, there are some principles that we've tried to articulate internally and we try to embody as we think about this with the rest of the world. So the first is that we should aim to be surgical and proportionate. You know, blocking an entire domain because there was one piece of copyrighted material obviously is wrong. But where those lines are, it's really hard to tell. And when we think about it, we try to be very surgical and very proportionate. We also think that principles of transparency, accountability, and consistency are incredibly important, and we try and focus on those over and over again. And one of our questions fundamentally is whether an invisible platform like Cloudflare can ever truly be accountable, can ever truly be transparent, and that's something that we struggle with. I have a hard time explaining to my father what Cloudflare does. I'm not sure how I'm going to explain it to the other 3 billion people that unknowingly pass through our network every month. What's important, though, is that we do all face, as private organizations, a corporate responsibility. And that's something that a lot of people have talked about in terms of harmful content online, but it's important to recognize other types of harmful content that aren't just neo-Nazis. We spend an enormous amount of time controlling and taking down botnets, stopping some of the world's largest denial of service attacks, mitigating phishing scams and other problems that are across the internet. And all of those efforts go into what is our corporate responsibility. And it is our mission to help build a better internet. And so we work on things like Project Galileo, where we offer our services at no cost to organizations that are serving a political or an artistic or politically important purpose, and make sure that no matter what, bullies can't censor that information or those ideas from being online, because that really is the telos of what the internet should stand for. And so 2 points that haven't really been brought up to this point, but I think are really things that I'm trying to think about a lot myself. The first is, I'm the son of a journalist. I grew up in the United States, and it's very tempting as a technology company to fall back, especially a US-based technology company, and say it's about the First Amendment and it's about freedom of expression. But I've come to realize myself that that's not the right place to start, and so I've been reading my James Madison and my Aristotle and trying to understand what are the principles that sit behind the principle of free expression. And again, I keep coming back to thinking about how do we ensure that whoever it is that's regulating or controlling content online has a level of transparency, has a level of accountability, and has a level of consistency. Because those are the things that are necessary for the rule of law, and that's really important as you have platforms and organizations as large as the ones represented in this room. And the second thing that is a small point but an important point is that we need to think not about this on a company-by-company basis, but on a product-by-product basis. If you think about the incredible diversity of products that a company like Google represents, each of those products might have a different set of responsibilities and a different set of rules and regulations. And trying to apply one blanket policy across an entire company is a mistake that we need to avoid. So thank you very much for having me. Really enjoying the conversation and looking forward to making some progress.
Thank you very much. And it's a great start to actually have already mentioned Aristotle and the rest. It's good. I think it's important to go to actually a sort of philosophical layer of where we ground our principles on. It's now my pleasure to give the floor to KATHERINE GETAO, who is the Secretary in the Ministry of Information, Communications and Technology of Kenya. KATHERINE, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Bertrand, and your colleagues at the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network for inviting me, and for the Canadian government for supporting my participation. I'll just focus on one issue because I'm very conscious of the 6 minutes, although as Africans we're famous for not understanding time. And that is on data, the cost of data, the benefits of data, and what the agenda should be. Firstly, I believe that there's very good model legislation and very good ideas coming from the developed world. But sometimes the cost of implementing that legislation for developing countries is prohibitive. Firstly, we adopt many of these models without understanding their short and long-term impacts on our own environment, which is emerging differently from environments in the West and in the developed world. Secondly, our capacity is distracted because data should both be protected, but it should also prosper. And if our capacity is all focused on complying with legislation that has been developed in different jurisdictions with norms, we lose that capacity for interpreting our own environment. And secondly, there is the cost of consuming data. In the West, I believe you have different models of costing your internet bandwidth, but we buy bundles. And a lot of these bundles are used up by models of updating software and so on that waste our ability to use the internet productively for our own purposes. Then there's the issue of the benefits we receive from the data. Now, every day in developing countries, we subscribe to thousands of free services, and we do it in exchange for our data. But we are data naive. We don't know how valuable the data is that we are giving up. Recently, I was making a joke that Google Assistant was listening to me without my knowledge. And it was able, when it actually turned on, to understand what I was saying, despite my Kenyan English and idiom. So in the future, the products which will understand Kenyans will not be coming from Kenya. People in other parts of the world who have superior technology and superior learning algorithms using the data that I have freely given up in my naivety will develop the technologies that I'll be able to use in the future. Is there a way to both acknowledge where the learning comes from and secondly, in some way to compensate those who give up this data in the way you would if you were buying my coffee or other products which I locally developed. So I'm grateful to the organizers for inviting me here. I hope that I'll have the ability to be a fresh voice and to raise new issues and to advocate for a simple, universal rule set that will protect us but will also enable economic development, inclusion, and an emphasis on the things we find important. And I think I can be congratulated for using only half my time.
Yeah, it's amazing. Thank you very much. And just one short comment. When you talk about the cost of implementation, it completely resonates with the question of the size of companies and whether the regulations are or should be or not adapted to the size of companies and whether there are disproportionate burdens or not. And that goes for legislations across borders as for the different types even of actors, not even companies. Last but not least, let me give the floor now to Henriette ESTERHUYSEN, who is the Director of Policy and Strategy for the Association for Progressive Communications. And those who know her know that she was the Executive Director of APC previously, and it's a pleasure to have you as well. Henriette, please.
Thank you, Bertrand.
It's coming.
Thanks for being here. It's having watched this process since its inception, it's really an honor to be here. Others have already emphasized why it is important and why internet and jurisdiction and the policy networks work is important. So I will focus my remarks on going forward. And as Bertrand always says, there are always 3 points. I think you learned that in diplomacy school. So 3 points that I think we should consider going forward. Firstly, I think the solutions we developed need to be end-to-end or adopt an end-to-end approach. And reading the preparatory papers, which are really impressive, I commend all those who have worked on them. I think that is the approach that's being adopted. We already have some excellent sets of principles to draw on. And some of these, I think civil society, the sector I come from, deserve recognition for having been proactive in developing them. For example, the Manila Principles on intermediary liability, and the international principles on the application of human rights to communication surveillance. I think there are people in the room who worked on those, known as the necessary and proportionate principles. There's also the Net Mundial principles that Kathy Brown has already mentioned, developed was an outcome of a multi-stakeholder process with emphasis on human rights, on inclusive policy making, on economic development. And we'll hear later, we've heard already from VINT, and we'll hear later more about the norm on the protection of the public core of the internet, developed by the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. The difficulty is that principles are not enough. And I think the INJ process needs to consider that the solutions that evolve or are developed from the process identify principles, but also the means for their application, for checking if they're being applied, and for accountability or remedy when they are not applied. Non-binding doesn't have to mean non-accountability. Voluntary agreements should not come at the expense of due process. They should actually help us establish sustainable due process in the long run. And that's what I mean by an end-to-end approach. Secondly, I think we have to avoid the trap of going for the lowest common denominator or minimum standards. There's an assumption that this only happens in intergovernmental context, where states notoriously often fail to agree on anything other than the most mundane. A classic example, and I think many people in the room have sat through this example, is when the United Nations Commission on Science and Technology for Development negotiates the annual resolution on WSIS follow-up and implementation, particularly with regard to the IGF, Internet Governance Forum. So some states will propose text to the effect that the IGF was successful, or this year's IGF was successful and made a meaningful contribution to building understanding and cooperation among all stakeholders around complex internet governance issues. Other states will only agree to mention of the IGF at all if there's equal praise of events convened by the International Telecommunications Union. Hours of negotiation will eventually result in something like this. We note the holding of the 10th meeting of the Internet Governance Forum hosted by the government of Brazil. Full stop. And I'm quoting here. So I think this process really needs to move beyond that. I think the highest standards need to be aspired to when we're looking at the protection of human rights. And pragmatism is great, but it shouldn't come at the expense of those fundamental rights. Similarly, standards for inclusion, for bringing diverse voices, geographical and otherwise, into the process also needs to be high. The tokenism that so often characterizes our multi-stakeholder processes should be avoided. Thirdly, chickens and eggs. I think it's already been pointed out that often the proposed solutions to harmful content in particular can have unintended consequences, create new problems. The design of the INJ process, and I think the work that people do going forward up to Berlin, should avoid this pitfall. The strength of this process does lie in its evidence-based, operational, solution-oriented approach, and that is really incredibly valuable. But I think it can go beyond that. For the broader internet governance community, and I think we are represented in many respects, the challenge is greater. It's not just about solutions. It's also about considering underlying causes of the problems that we're addressing. And what came first, the egg or the chicken? What are the basic trends or business models that created the problems we're trying to address in the first place? And when do we actually need solutions that are more fundamental and possibly more disruptive. The INJ process, I think, can contribute to that, even if that's not within its direct scope or mandate. I think it can inform this process of identifying when we need more fundamental disruptive intervention. Deciding, how do we not just create solutions to problems, but prevent the internet changing in ways that undermines its fundamental potential for innovation, for development, and for enabling rights rather than putting rights at risk. Thank you, Bertrand.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Henriette, for those remarks. And in fact, thank you to all the opening speakers for those very inspiring and, I believe, motivating and substantive remarks.